Have you ever wondered whether YHVH has been trying to get your attention, but you were simply too distracted to hear him?
Yeah, Dion, certainly I have. Some things that we read over and over again in scripture aren't by accident, right? And what if the repetition is actually revealing a pattern to us? And what if the pattern is not merely something to understand, but something that is meant to change the way that we live?
Yes, today we are going back to the roots. We're going to look at one simple thing: repetition. And you may never look at repetition in scripture quite the same way again. So, Shalom, Leon, מה שלומך?
שלום דיון, תודה רבה, טוב מאוד, ואתה, מה שלומך?
אני בסדר, תודה.
Dion, so I'm going to start sharing the screen here, and then we can start our presentation for today, which is, of course, very interesting, and I can't wait for all of us to hear the message that YHVH has given us today. So it's just to say that Ancient Code 333 is a Back to the Roots initiative, a conversation where Dion and I go searching through scripture, Hebrew history, life, and the patterns YHVH has placed before us.
And we're not coming here claiming we have all the answers. Quite opposite, we're asking questions. We're searching, we're testing, we're discovering.
Yeah, Dion, that's true. And our foundation is found in one very powerful verse, Jeremiah 33, verse 3.
Yes, the foundation, Jeremiah 33, verse 3, YHVH says, "Call to me and I will answer you and tell you great and hidden things that you have not known."
That verse gives us the heart, Dion, of Ancient Code 333. We call, we listen, we discover. Because perhaps there are things in Scripture we have read many times, but never really saw or never really understood in the way that the Spirit wants to reveal it to us.
And that is important because the hidden things don't necessarily have to mean mysterious secrets. Sometimes something is hidden simply because we haven't noticed it yet.
Yeah, exactly. It may have been there for a very long time. We've read it over and over again. We've passed over it. And then one day we stop and the Spirit inside us speaks and we ask a question. And suddenly, Dion, we see a pattern. Isn't that so?
Yes. So we go over to the word of the day. And as we do in every Ancient Code 333 episode, we want to introduce you to a little Hebrew, not simply so we can learn another word, but because language can open another door into the scriptures.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Dion. And I'm so glad that you, with all your Hebrew history and all the Hebrew that you've learned over the years from Hebrew people and Dion, now that you can actually assist us in explaining so many things. So Dion, what is our Hebrew word for today?
Okay, so Hebrew word for today is Pishnaim.
Yeah, so we just to emphasize, in Hebrew we read from right to left. So pei yot, it pronounces the word pi, and then the shin, the nun, the yot, and the mem, shnaim, shnaim. So pi shnaim. And what does pi shnaim mean, Dion?
And the expression literally carries the idea of a mouth of two. So the Shnaim is two and P is the mouth. And in its biblical context refers to the double portion given to the firstborn. We find that in Deuteronomy 21, verse 17.
Okay, and so immediately it's double, it's two, and that, Dion, gets our attention.
But let's make an important distinction. Pishnahim does not literally mean repetition. P
Okay.
relate to mouth, as I said, and Shnaim means two. But as we meditate on the phrase, the idea of two gives us the doorway into today's subject, which is doubling, repetition, and emphasis.
Okay, and that is exactly where ancient code begins. Because sometimes when Yute Vave wants to draw our attention to something, he repeats it, right, in the word. There's many examples of that.
Yes, the one we got is Nachamu, Nachamu.
Mhm.
We get it in Isaiah 40, verse 1. The Hebrew says, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, Yomar Elohechem. This comfort,
Okay.
comfort my people, says your God.
Okay, and there is Nachamu, and again Nachamu, which is the double of comfort, comfort, emphasis on the comfort. So Yute Vave wants his people to be comforted.
Yes, so why twice?
That's the question, Dion. Why does scripture sometimes repeat a word? Why does Yute Vave sometimes repeat a name of a person? What is he drawing our attention towards?
Perhaps the first, which is listen, and the second, listen, this is important.
We shouldn't say that every biblical repetition has exactly the same meaning, but repeated words, names, clearly draws our attention and very often creates an urgency and heightens the significance of that specific moment. And now we're beginning to see a pattern. Repetition produces attention. Repetition, attention, right?
Yes, so it refers to look at 2 ears. Are we listening with both ears? And Leon, this is where I think the message becomes very personal. We have 2 ears, and perhaps that is a beautiful reminder. Listen, then listen again.
But there's a difficult question. And that's the thing, Dion. My wife often says this to me, right? Are you actually listening to me, Leon? But that's the thing. Not just hearing sounds, not just reading words, but truly, truly listening. The Hebrew word shema, right?
Yes, Shema, because we live in a world that is designed to capture our attention. Our phones, notifications, WhatsApp, social media, YouTube, advertising, television, music, podcast, news, entertainment, politics, opinions, and many more.
Yeah, and some of these things aren't necessarily bad in themselves, right? Not necessarily, but what we receive through that medium is bad. But the sheer volume of voices can become a distraction for us. It can mean that we can't clearly distinct or hear the voice of our creator. Our attention is constantly being claimed.
Yes, and perhaps our greatest problem isn't that Yorevave, God isn't speaking. Perhaps our problem is that we aren't listening.
Exactly, Dion. We can spend hours listening to everybody else. We can spend hours watching a TV show. We can spend hours watching rugby or cricket. But what about Yute Vave? And then give Yute Vave this little time in the day. You know, we start the day, okay, let me read the Proverbs of the day, 10 minutes, okay, I'm done.
Yes, so perhaps Nachamu is asking us a question, not just what does this verse mean, but what has Yorevave already said that I have failed to hear?
That's the sad thing, Dion. And perhaps an even more personal question that we can ask ourselves is, can I distinguish the voice? Can I distinguish the voice of Yute Vave, my beloved Father, from all the voices in this world competing for my attention?
So now, so let's look at something fascinating. Because Nachamu isn't the only place where we encounter repetition like this.
Yeah, let's look at four names. 4 times in the Bible this happens. Father says, Abraham, Abraham, Yaakov, Yaakov, Jacob, Jacob, Moshe, Moshe, Moses, Moses, and also to the little baby boy, Samuel, 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 Samuel.
Yes, in Genesis 22, we get the Abraham, and Avram responds by saying, Hineni, here I am.
Yeah, and also Genesis 42 verse 6, Yaakov or Jacob, Yaakov, and Jacob says, here I am.
Yes, Exodus 3, verse 4, Moshe, he says, Moshe, and Moshe says, here I am.
Yeah, and then 1 Samuel 3 verse 10, which is something that I remember since being a small boy when my grade 1 teacher told me this story of Samuel. I remember this story from my heart. And the 1 Samuel 3 verse 10 says, Shemuel. And Shemuel responds, speak, for your servant hears.
Yes, so Leon, that's quite a pattern we got there. Yorevave calls, the name is repeated, the person stops, the person listens, and the person responds.
Exactly, Dion. And perhaps it's our first significant ancient code that we can clarify is that repetition matters because repetition actually captures attention.
Yes, but Leon, there's something else we can't ignore. Moshe heard Yorevave. Moshe responded, Hineni, here I am. But later at the rock, Moshe did not faithfully carry out the instruction Yorevave had given him.
Yeah, so that brings us to an important distinction, Dion, is that I can say, here I am. I can say that. But hearing is not necessarily obedience.
Exactly, we can hear scripture, we can study scripture, we can discuss scripture, we can teach scripture, we can even become very knowledgeable about scripture and still not walk what we have heard.
And that is where the pattern becomes practical. We have spoken before about re'eh in the previous parasha, 2 parashas ago, which means see. So now we're discovering another dimension. When we hear, we choose, Dion, we make a decision, which is something that was given to mankind, is the ability of choice. So we hear, we choose, and then we start practicing what we've heard and what we've chosen. And that actually forms a habit. And this habit contributes towards our character. And our character is what is built to walk in the image of the one who created us.
Yes, so let's unpack all that. We hear, then we choose. Our choice has to become practice, and repeated practice becomes a habit. Habits shape character, and character increasingly determines the image we reflect. And
Exactly.
it's similar like you do an athlete training, and it becomes a habit, and it becomes who he is.
Yeah, exactly, Dion. And habits are not formed in one day. Habits are formed over time. So that's why, at Back to the Roots, our focus is on patterns so that we can form these habits. We aren't discovering patterns simply to have something interesting to talk about or try to impress people with our patterns. We're discovering patterns because they are meant to become ways of life. Repetition forms us. And now I see something else, Dion. There are two sides to repetition. Vave repeats something to get our attention, first of all. And then he repeats our choices to form ourselves. Yes, that's the connection. Vave's repetition captures our attention. Our repetition and practice forms our character and shapes our character.
We can say one choice might seem insignificant, but one choice repeated becomes a pattern. A pattern repeated becomes a habit. A habit repeated shapes character, and character reveals who we are becoming.
Yeah, Dion, that's so important. And that brings us back to our broader Back to the Roots journey. Why we have undertaken this journey and why I think I have received this download from our Father to walk the Back to the Roots root with people. It's that mankind has a choice. Every morning when we wake up, we have a choice. We have a choice, and our identity is actually anchored in the Creator Himself. So when we make the right choices, we walk the right pattern. So if it's choice and we walk in the identity, we walk the right pattern, we practice what He has intended for us to practice, and then we form the right habits. Not the wrong habits, the right habits. And that forms our character. And then, only then, can our character be a reflection of the image of the Creator.
And so the pattern of hearing fits beautifully. Hear, we choose, then we practice, then we form a habit, and then we develop a character, and then we reflect the image of the creator of the universe. And this brings us to a Hebrew word that I think is critical, and that is hineni. Here I am.
Dion, so that's something that I saw now in the word, that Abraham said, Hineni, Yaakov said, Hineni, Moshe said, Hineni, and Shemuel said, speak, for your servant hears.
Yes, and hineni is more than just simply saying, here I am physically. It expresses presence, attention, availability.
Yeah, that's so true, Dion. That's so true. Thank you for clarifying that, because there's a difference between I heard you and Hineni. The first acknowledges the sound, the second represents the person, and that is where things become serious. Because when Yutevave calls, what then actually happens, Dion, after we put up our hand and say, Hineni?
And this is where I believe the pattern takes us to the next level, which is hineni shlacheni. It means, here I am, send me. In Isaiah 6, verse 8, it says this powerful response that we get. Yoreh asks, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And Isaiah responds, here I am, send me. Hineni shlacheni.
So, so, so Shlacheni sent me willingness to be sent. I volunteer, right? I volunteer. So the pattern becomes a call, then I hear, I say, here I am in any, I choose, I obey, I practice, I form the habit becomes character, I walk in the image, and then it is Shlacheni. And that's powerful, Dion, because the journey doesn't end with I heard. It doesn't end with I understand. It moves forward. I am willing to walk, and eventually it says, send me.
And that brings us to another scriptural truth into the conversation. We were bought at a price. So when we say hineni shlacheni, we aren't simply volunteering for another project. We're recognizing that our lives ultimately belongs to Yodevave.
Yeah, Dion, I've often been in churches, and then the pastor would ask, who's ready? Who's ready? And people raise their hands. And then in my inner being, I often wonder, yo, do we know what we're saying we're ready for? Because yes, the person who says, here I am, send me, is surrendering the idea that life is simply about doing whatever I want. It's not about me. It's less and less of me and more of you. John 3 verse 30. I am yours, Abba Father. I am listening. I am willing. Lead me.
Yes, so Leon, that brings us back to the today's Hebrew word, which is been pishnahim.
Mm. Yeah, that perhaps now we can say and we can see why this phrase fits today's discussion, Dion. Because again, we don't want to claim that Peshnaim literally means repetition. It doesn't. But it gives the concept of two. And two gets us thinking about double, repetition, emphasis, a second wisdom, a witness, a repeated call.
So Leon, and you've been also been exploring the Hebrew letters themselves.
Yeah, and again, Dion, I want us to distinguish between Hebrew language and Hebrew letter meditation. We shouldn't say that this is hidden dictionary meaning of the word. It's not the meaning of the word. It was simply a picture that was allocated from ancient times to each letter. Instead, we can meditate on the letters and ask what they stimulate us to consider. That is part of our discovery process.
That gives us another ancient code pattern. It's discover, to discover things and to test those things.
Yeah, exactly. We discover something. For instance, P, the pay, the first letter of P is an open mouth. And the second letter is a yud, which resembles the covenant. So we discover something. We don't immediately declare it as truth, but we actually walk it out because we search scripture, we compare, we test, and we remain humble. That's the biggest thing of all, is to remain humble.
So, Leon, I think our viewers need to understand something. What exactly is ancient code 333?
Yeah, Dion, so I think through what you and I have discussed today, a marvelous revelation to everybody to see that, to first of all see that Ancient Code 333 is a back to the roots initiative. It's something that wants to take us back to the root of all civilization, which is our Father, Yud-Vave, and through whom we were created. It is our opportunity to search for the patterns that Yud-Vave has put for us in His Word, as the manual of life is clearly and explicitly explaining and showing patterns, and these patterns are appropriate and through the creation of life.
Yes, and we want to ask some questions. Why does Yodevave do this? Why does this appear again? Why is this word repeated? And why does this pattern appear in another place? And lastly, what does it reveal?
And most importantly, Dion, I think, how do we walk it? How do we actually make it practical to our lives in today's society? So often we hear people say, yes, but the Bible was written 2,000 years ago. But very often I hear people say it was written 2,000 years ago, but it's still applicable to us today. We want transformation as human beings. We want that. And transformation can come from the word because we want the truth, which can give us the right choices, which is actually confirming our identity in which we are anchored, which forms the pattern that we can see. And the pattern gives us the time to practice. The practice forms a habit. The habit forms our character. And then we walk in the image of our Creator.
So perhaps we are actually discovering our method as we go. We first notice, then we ask, then we search, and then we compare.
Yes, and we recognize the pattern, Dion. I think that's important. And we test the pattern and we understand the pattern and we actually walk the pattern, because the purpose of discovering a pattern is not merely to know it in our head. The purpose of a pattern is to walk it out, because only when we walk it out, Dion, can we assist others to follow that pattern.
And that takes us back to where we started. Jeremiah 3:33. Call to me and I will answer you.
It's all about relationship, isn't it, Dion?
Yes, and it says further on, and tell you, and tell you great and hidden things.
Yeah, humility, because we don't know everything, right, Dion? And there are things we haven't seen, things we haven't understood, patterns we haven't yet recognized.
Is that you have not known.
Exactly. That is the heart of Ancient Code 333, is to discover these patterns.
And that should be our purpose, not we know, but show us.
Perhaps it isn't some mysterious secret hidden behind the number of times a word appears. Perhaps it's much simpler. Yutavave repeats to get our attention. Nachamu, Nachamu, Avraham, Avraham. The repetition says, stop, listen, pay attention.
Yes, and then we have a choice, Leon.
And the choices begins with the next pattern, Dion. Again, we repeat it. We hear. And patterns are so important. So excuse all the repetitions that we have today. But patterns are, yeah, we choose. We make a choice on what we have heard. We practice that choice. And that forms a habit. And that habit develops our character, like you rightfully said. And that character is how we walk and represent the thumbprint of God Most High to act in his image.
Yes, and eventually we have this image, we have a witness, and we have the sending out.
Yes, so the pattern isn't complete when we discover it.
It is complete when we walk it out.
And that's the heart of Back to the Roots. We return to the root, we discover the ancient path, and along that ancient path, Yutevave reveals the patterns.
So perhaps today's ancient code is repetition reveals pattern.
Absolutely, Dion. Isn't it so? Repetition reveals pattern. If we practice and we train, and we can't be a 100-meter athlete unless we've trained very hard. We can't play a rugby match unless we've trained very hard. So pattern requires practice.
Yes, so practice forms habits, which forms our character.
Yes, and character reveals the image we are becoming, right, Dion? It's like the Springbok rugby team. If it wasn't for their practice that formed their character, we wouldn't have won all those World Cups. So the image of the Springbok team has become a great image.
Yes, so once you are formed, the one who has been formed is prepared to be sent.
Yeah, so before we finish, I want to leave you with a challenge to everybody. Don't just read scripture this week. Look for repetition. When you see a word repeated, stop. When you see a name repeated, stop. When you see a pattern appearing again, stop. And ask yourself the question, why?
And then ask yourself, what has Yorevave already said that I have failed to hear?
Yes, Dion. And then the harder question, what have I heard in the past that I have not obeyed?
And perhaps the deepest question is, what pattern has Yorevave been showing me repeatedly, but I have never stopped long enough to recognize it?
Yeah, because once we've seen these patterns, once we've seen the truth, we have a choice.
Once we hear, we have a choice.
Once we recognize the pattern, we have a choice, right?
Yes, and perhaps our response needs to be, come, hineni, here I am.
And ultimately, Dion, Hineni Shelacheni, here I am, Abba, send me. Whatever it is that you have planned for me, send me.
Yes, Yorevave calls, we listen, we discover.
We recognize the pattern, and then, Dion, we test it. As all human beings always do, we test it, and then we choose.
Yes, and then we practice and we form the habit as we practice, and the habit shapes our character.
And the character increasingly reflects the image of the Creator. And then, Hineni, here I am, Shelacheni, send me. Because then we are representing the image and the character of Yutevave, our Creator.
So returning to the root, that's what we do, and discovering the ancient path and recognizing the patterns.
Dion, and I think the important thing is that we learn together to walk them. And if something in today's conversation made you stop and think, don't keep it for yourself. Share this episode with other people, please.
And if you want to join us as we continue researching the scriptures for the patterns, we may have overlooked things we have maybe overlooked. So subscribe to the Back to the Roots YouTube channel.
Yes, we're still a relatively small community, but every journey starts somewhere with the first step, right? And perhaps you are one of the people Yutevave has brought here for a reason. So don't just watch the episode. Come and search with us.
And
Communicate with us.
Yes, and until next time, shalom.
Shalom, Dion, and thank you so much for this wonderful episode. I really appreciate your time. The purpose of discovering the pattern is to walk the pattern, right, Dion? And let's just repeat that. The call, we listen, we discover, we recognize, we test, we choose, we practice, we form the habit forms our character, walking in the image, and then we can be sent. Hineni Shalacheni. Thank you, Dion.
Toda raba.